barring a miracle of God. That was one aspect of misery. The very fact of the symptoms of this disease made the leper miserable. Perhaps you have been sick or are sick right now. One of the comforts of one who is sick in the church today is that they can be visited by the other members of the congregation. They can get cards and fruit and flowers and words of comfort. But if you were a leper, you had no such comfort, because a leper was pushed out of the camp of Israel and had to live outside. We read of that too. Lepers had to live outside the camp. And so they were cut off from the fellowship of the people of God. They could not attend worship in the tabernacle or the temple. They could not have any fellowship with the people of God. They lived as outcasts and as those who were socially excluded from society. And so verse 45 of Leviticus tells us that they had to have their heads bare, their upper lips covered, and they cry out when anyone would see them, "Unclean! Unclean!" And so no one would be able to approach a leper. They lived lives of intolerable loneliness. And therefore it's not surprising to find in our text 10 men who were lepers living together, because only lepers could live with other lepers. Nor is it surprising to find that one of them was a Samaritan, even though Samaritans and Jews were natural enemies. If you all have the same horrible disease, you're going to come together naturally, because that's the only kind of fellowship that you could possibly get. But that's not the real misery of leprosy. It's bad enough to have a horrible disease. It's worse to have no fellowship with the people of God. But worse than all of this was the fact that leprosy was itself a picture of the corruption of sin. That's what all these Old Testament laws were pointing to. That's why God gave this disease as a sign to his people in the Old Testament. Notice all the details in Leviticus 13. You did not have to have arms missing or deformed limbs or your fingers dropped off or to be covered head to toe in horrible boils in order to be classified as a leper and therefore as one who is unclean. Notice we read in Leviticus 13. All you had to do was discover some little spot on your hand, go to the priest would examine you, and he would say, based on his knowledge as a priest, you are declared unclean. Out of the camp you go. And so, this would teach us that even the smallest hint of sin is so serious that it must lead to a man being put outside of the church. That was the point of the fact that sin is so loathsome to God, he will not tolerate even the smallest hint of it in his church, because it spreads like leaven throughout the church. You see, leprosy is a very fitting picture of sin, specifically of the corruption and pollution and defiling power of sin. Leprosy is like sin in this way. As leprosy corrupts the entire body from head to toe, so sin spreads throughout the entire person, rendering him totally depraved. It takes hold of a person, and eventually it becomes an ingrained habit in his life, so he has no way of breaking free of sin, and eventually this sin drags him down to eternal destruction in hell. And like leprosy, sin is incurable. Only by the all-powerful grace of God can sinners be saved from their sins. No works that a man can do. Nothing that a man can do to try and heal himself of sin will work. Only God, by his power, can deliver us from the pollution and the corruption and the enslavement of sin. And just as we would find a leper to be utterly disgusting if we saw one, so God looks upon sin as that which is loathsome in his sight. And so it's a perfect picture of sin. Lepers could have no fellowship with the people of God, and sinners outside of the cleansing power of Jesus Christ can have no fellowship with God either. So that was the misery of this poor leper. He had the horrible disease of leprosy. He was cut off from fellowship with the people of God, and he was a walking picture of the defilement and corruption of sin. And yet, the text tells us, he was cleansed. He's a cleansed leper in the text. He met Jesus Christ. As Jesus Christ was going into a certain village on his way to Jerusalem, these 10 miserable wretches called out to Jesus and said, "Jesus, Master, have mercy upon us." If Jesus had been a Pharisee, he would have taken one look at those lepers, picked up his skirts, and run in the opposite direction. But Jesus was no Pharisee. But neither did he do anything terribly dramatic to them. He did not say, "Be thou cleansed." He did not touch them as he had done with other cases of leprosy. He said something to them which was rather surprising. Verse 14. When he saw them, he said unto them, "Go, show yourselves unto the priests." They had no promise of being cleansed. They did not know what Jesus meant by this, but off they went to see the priests. And why did Jesus give this particular commandment? Because in the Old Testament, the ceremonial law still applied, and Jesus at this time was still under the ceremonial law. And what was the role of the priest under the ceremonial law? First of all, he was to detect cases of leprosy. Then he was to confirm that people who claimed to be cleansed of leprosy were actually now ceremonially clean. And so Jesus is saying to these men, "Go, show yourselves to the priest, because I say unto you that you are now ceremonially clean." And this then would give given them some hope. As they walk towards the priest, they must have understood that they are, or are shortly going to be, ceremonially clean, because there's no point in going to the priests unless you have some hope of being cleansed. Imagine a leper covered head to toe in sores knocks on the door of the priest and says, "Jesus of Nazareth sent me to you." He would look at them with disgust and say, "Why in the world did Jesus send you to me?" But this word contained a promise that they were actually going to be cleansed of their leprosy. And so they walked off believing this and hoping this. Also, Jesus gave this commandment because he wanted everyone to know that his miracles were genuine. The Pharisees wanted to claim that Jesus' miracles were a fraud, but he sent these men to the priests, who were the competent authorities of that day, to prove that when he cleansed the leper, that leper was really cleansed. And what happened when they went to see the priests?